Time grows short. It is just more than a year and 3 months from now, the next elected president of the United States will be walking into his office in the executive mansion, which Teddy Roosevelt christened the White House. So on this occasion, in addition to discussing 3 topics which I shall present here today, I'll preface the discussion of those topics by giving you some indication of what I will be doing in the first hour that I walk from the inauguration into the executive mansion and start to do things. There are 2 areas I will refer to. One is health care, and the first we have a problem today in health care which is accentuated by the fact that people who were still adolescents at the time that the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, at the time that Kennedy was assassinated, at the time that the Indochina War officially opened, are now in their 50s or 60s. Some coming into that. And they're beginning to experience some of the health care problems which come about the time you reach 50 or so, for at least for many people. And they're therefore experiencing some of the health care problems which many of my generation are also experiencing. The health care system is breaking down. Also, at the same time, we have returning from wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or not yet returning or never to return, members not only of the regular military services, but the reserves and the National Guard. We're coming back, a large number of them with various injuries, other health problems, some severe trauma cases, being hidden, being deprived of the neat care they need. So health care is an extremely important problem on which the next president must act on those matters which the present incumbent president fails to act upon. One of the first actions I shall take, therefore, is to act to reopen fully DC General Hospital as a full-service public hospital. At the same time, I shall issue a recommended piece of legislation to the Congress, which will restore, it'd be about a 5 to 7 page paper to be legislated up, not longer, which will restore the Hill-Burton legislation and will repeal the HMO legislation which was installed in 1973 by the Nixon administration. I shall also take immediate action within the power of the executive and by proposed legislation to the Congress to fully reactivate the Veterans Hospital system. I shall also take similar action to re-energize the public health system, which used to be a system under which people who wished to become physicians could, by volunteering for this program and being qualified, would receive a medical education under the condition that at some time they would perform a certain amount of public service as employees of the government or others in the public health system. And some of our prison doctors and so forth went through that route. This is also an institution which protects us on things that fall between the cracks, such as epidemics, local crises, emergencies. And the staff of the public health system has been cut back. I would propose to restore that and re-energize it for the needs we have today. particularly where the cracks arise in the healthcare system. This is the institution which should look into the matter and make a recommendation or even act. We need to respond, as I said, to the problems of our aging population, which includes not only those of my generation and slightly older, but those who are now in their 50s. We find friends in their 50s and early 60s dying or facing very severe healthcare problems. We find that under the present arrangement, when they go into a hospital or seek care, they're placed in jeopardy unnecessarily by the kind of new rules which have been introduced in the progressive deterioration of our healthcare system under the impact of HMO. We have to make reforms in this direction. We have to, among other things, to ensure that there is no criteria for delivery of medical care except the decision of a physician. We must eliminate the HMO provision under which the physician is given the right to only make a checklist of care you receive and deliver that amount of care only in the amount prescribed by some accountant in some firm, not a medical professional. That must end. We must restore physicians' rights to do whatever they think is necessary to assist a patient. Now, this goes to something else as well. It goes to preventive medical care. As a former Surgeon General discussed this matter with me, and I took that instruction from her as a charge, which I'm now delivering here. Well, the problem we have is that under the Roosevelt administration, Franklin Roosevelt, and afterwards, we had an improvement in life expectancy in this country. As a result of that, people live long enough to get some of the diseases of aging. Increase in cancer, other kinds of disease which go with the aging process. Therefore, we have a new category in the past decades of health care, of kinds of medical needs which did not exactly exist in periods where life expectancy was shorter. Therefore, the emphasis has to be placed now on preventive health care. This means provisions that we make in the interest of public health to protect people from these risks. And also that means that we must give the physician the opportunity when treating a patient to make recommendations to that patient and to prescribe measures to be taken, either as medical advice or actual prescribed care, which will help that person to avoid the penalties of some of these sicknesses. Actually, the cost to a society of giving the physician and medical facilities the freedom to make these kinds of decisions and take these kinds of actions will cheapen the cost of health care. Because preventive health care, where it's appropriate, is a lot less expensive than waiting for the catastrophe which HMO finally acknowledges to exist. So therefore, physicians' rights, freedom from having accountants run medical practice is an essential measure on which I would act on the first hour I were in the White House. We also need a special investigation on diseases of aging of tissue. This is the frontier which affects not only the aging, but in the history of mankind, study of the things that happen to people as they become older are valuable in our approach to the problems of people when they are younger. If you catch a disease in this old age, or the period of old age, such as cancer research, which was used to be considered largely a disease of old age, and so forth. The work that you do on that then enables you to deal with other areas of care, frontiers of care, where you have failed previously. And therefore, that must be part of our program. Now on the question of military reforms. We have to honor the veteran And it is my present intention in that respect not only to honor the veterans for past services, but for future services. That is, I propose, and I shall present to the Congress, proposed legislation which will restore universal military service. And I shall explain why I shall do that. First of all, it has been largely forgotten that national military service was the foundation of this country. We fought a revolutionary war. We had the idea of national military service then. Later, especially after 1815, the War of 1812-1815, we began to study in this country some reforms in military policy which have been introduced in Europe. For example, the work of Lazare Carnot, who is famous in France as the author of Victory, who saved France from destruction under his leadership, military leadership, between 1792 and 1794. Lazare Carnot, a young scientist, genius of his time, introduced the concept in a more precise form of what is called strategic defense, a change in the policy of war to strategic defense, away from cabinet warfare and preventive warfare, as it's called. This policy was understood by our country later, and was the policy of our greatest military commanders, as well as our sane governments, our presidents, such as Dwight Eisenhower and General Douglas MacArthur. You don't go to war for preventive purposes. And your purpose in warfare is defense of the nation, and to, as quickly as possible, with the least cost to both sides, to bring about and build a peace which creates peace where there was war. And by having these policies, often to avoid war. If the world knows that we are a peaceful nation, committed to a policy of military strategic defense, and that the purpose of our war making, if we are forced to make it, is to collaborate with the opponent nation and to rebuild to peace with the least possible damage to either side, as was the policy of Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific War, where he dealt with war on a larger area than any individual commander ever before, fought as few battles as were necessary by skipping islands on which Japanese forces were located. You don't have to go there. They're not going anyplace, and you don't have to go there and kill them. We did drop bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That had nothing to do with MacArthur. It had nothing to do with winning the war. The war was already run by blockade and by the conquest of the Pacific. But in this vast period of time, the shortest period of time, the greatest area, MacArthur, through a policy of strategic defense, won the war. Truman didn't. He nearly lost it. Also, a second thing we learned in warfare was the idea of mission orientation. Now, this came to us from Germany. It came from a great reformer, Gerhard Scharnhorst, who introduced the concept of mission orientation to warfare. It should be restored in Germany, but that's their business in their military policy. We certainly should adopt it here. Now, this has a larger implication. In the past, our concept of strategic defense included the role of the military Army Corps of Engineers. Most West Point officers were trained as military engineers. They built bridges, they built canals, they did other great public works. These were done by military men in part. The building of the railroads was largely done by military men, trained as officers, engineering officers. This institution has become unpopular. It's essential. If anyone remembers from World War II, The United States forces were not the best fighters in the world. They may have been the biggest machos in some respect, but they weren't the best fighters. They were better in the bar rooms than they were in the field of battle. The way we won the war was through Franklin Roosevelt's policies, before the war and during them. The United States forces overwhelmed the world with logistics, with technology and logistics. It was our superiority in logistics that enabled us to succeed where our military training fell short. And that applies today. Now, during that period, one of the factors in the war was an organization called the Civilian Conservation Corps. This institution brought young people from the streets, so to speak, and backwoods, and put them into a program under retired military service. That is, people who had been retired military officers would be in charge of these camps, of these CCC camps. And the boys lived in barracks. They were trained. They did various kinds of work of importance to our country. And many of them, as like the famous Michigan Division, they just marched out of the CC camps into the military and became a military division which fought overseas. People who went through this training, and also regular military training later, we transformed people scraped from the slums of the country and from the backwoods where they were virtually unknown. We put them into training in 16-week plus training programs, where I, for one, was in this program in a while, had some few platoons pass on to me. You see them lined up on the company street, and you say, we just lost World War II. But in the course of time, in a year or two of this kind of training and service, these fellows who had been pretty much abandoned people went on to become a vital and productive part of our economy and our society as the World War II veterans. So therefore today, when our economy is collapsing, when the infrastructure is collapsing, when we are about bankrupt, when we need infrastructure built, we need a military force. So why not use the military force as it was intended to be used by great engineers like Carnot and so forth? Why not train it, train an officer corps as engineers? It gives you the best possible capability if you need them for warfare. And certainly for doing what we can't do in Iraq, clean up the mess you made before leaving. It also, as a corps of engineers, is a force which can be deployed in assistance of large-scale infrastructure projects on the behalf of the federal government, the state governments, and also the local governments. It helps. We should also have, because we have many young people who have no qualifications for serious work at all. We need something equivalent to the CCC program by which we can track people who are lingering on the streets, victims of a drug culture where teachers and others have shoved Ritalin and Prozac and other dangerous drugs into them against their will, where we've turned them into a drug-dependent culture, and where the education system is worse than a bad joke. You don't pass education, it passes you. Therefore, under these conditions, we have to think of ways of taking these young people who have been victimized by the change in our culture. We have to think of ways of transforming them or helping them transform themselves into fully capable, productive people who are capable of supporting a family by their labor, by the fruit of their labor. We also have people parked in prisons who shouldn't be there because somebody wrote a bill or a new guidelines which puts people into extended periods in prison where they come out as a piece of junk. In many of these cases, which are minor drug cases where some prosecutor wants to make a score, they stick someone there for 10 to 20 years or longer just to make a score for the prosecutor under the guidelines by just piling up the charges. These people are often young people. There's a lot of discrimination in, because if you happen to be of a so-called African American origin, or if you happen to be of Hispanic disposition, you may get a bigger charge than if you weren't. So what we're doing now in our prison system, we're grinding people up when they need a slap on the wrist or something equivalent, and to turn them loose and turn them back into society quickly as productive people. Do you know what percentile of our population is in that category? Do you know what percentile of our so-called African American young males are in that category? Do you know how many of our young people of Hispanic origins are in that category? Do you realize what we're doing to our people by these kinds of policies? We need a general approach to rehabilitating society. And I intend to use the military tradition of the United States as one of the institutional instruments to promote that policy. There are no useless sons to be accommodated, but there are young people who can fit into something and make something of themselves if we give them the opportunity and the guidance. So why not give them something useful to do, something necessary to do, with the intention they shall come out of it as citizens in the full sense, self-respecting citizens. We must do that now. All right, everyone knows, I think, around the world today that I'm not a person likely to make war. As a matter of fact, I probably would get more peace by being President of the United States than any other single act. You go throughout the world today, you go through Eurasia, you go through other countries, and you compare other candidates, other prominent Americans who might become candidates, with my image in those parts of the world. The very fact that I were becoming president would cause a deep sigh of relief throughout Eurasia. But on the other hand, people know that I'm serious, unlike candidates who don't speak their mind, but go to an advisor and say, what should I be overheard saying not to get into trouble? We had a bunch of gutless candidates who all want to be president, and some of them want to go to war. Now, it was understood around the world, you don't fool with a LaRouche presidency. You get just treatment, but don't try to abuse it. I can be very firm, as some people know. I just don't like to be mean. Okay, now, there are three subjects that I want to take up after discussing some of the flavor of the White House during the first hour of my appearance on those premises. First of all, I want to touch upon something that Debbie mentioned, the aftermath of the California catastrophe, its effect on the current presidential campaign and other politics. Now, obviously, one of the important roles of a president is to help re-elect an improved House of Representatives. That is, a good presidential candidacy in a time of hot issues can pretty much change the composition of the U.S. House of Representatives. If you have candidates running on the coattails of that presidential candidate, they're likely to get elected. Now, we need some big improvements in the Congress, but especially in the House of Representatives, where improvement without delay, and I do mean Tom delay, is urgently required. So don't complain too much about the House of Representatives. It's about to be improved, particularly if I succeed. Because I guarantee you, if I'm running as a Democratic nominee for president, we're going to win the Congress. We're going to win the House of Representatives. It's a sure thing. Now, secondly, the Senate's not too bad. That takes us back to California. As Debbie said, I went into California as soon as the recall threat was made. And I communicated to the circles of the governor of California that while he'd made some mistakes, that I was opposed to his being subjected to the recall, and proposed several things to him, one of which he did. I said, don't take all the blame for what happened in the California situation. Everybody in the political system from 1996 on put deregulation into place. Everybody did it. Worse, Arnie Schwarzenegger was part of the crowd that did the stealing. Schultz's man, Enron's man, did the stealing. And the stealing got really bad beginning 2001 and 2002 when Vice President Dick Cheney intervened to squash an exposure of the fraud being run by firms like Enron against California, as in the Williams case. And the whole pack of neocons, including Dick Cheney, got into this government through George Shultz, who's the big backer and controller of this Geek Show Act, now about to become governor. Carnival Geek Show Act. That's its political qualifications. So what happened in the situation is the governor did do some things I thought he should do. He did say that he had to shoulder his responsibility for being soft on the deregulation issue, especially in his handling it during the crisis of this past year. Fine. Honest man. Usually a tough fighter. But some of the Democratic Party people, the national candidates, either didn't intervene in California, or they went out like weak, silly sisters, including General Clark, who I call a general failure on the basis of his performance there. He's recommended as a staff officer, but never put him in command, according to some of his fellows. Rhodes Scholar more than anything else. So these fellows failed, or they actually made things worse, or they pressured the Democratic National Committee, pressured the governor of California not to fight, to lay down and accept his fate. We intervened, some others intervened, but I had the good fortune to have a youth movement, which is we can have some discussion about right now, but we'll get first a few points. In this youth movement especially, with my full backing and my participation, we moved in, as Debbie indicated, in areas of California, the County of Los Angeles and the Bay Area in particular. And we moved in to turn it around. And we did turn it around. We turned it around wherever we were. But there weren't enough of us, and there were too many of the other 10 candidates, and too many of the Democratic National Committee's leadership right now. Now, you know that the decision on the election of a president lies to a large degree with the state of California. The Democratic National Committee, fully aware of that, my 10 sloppy rivals, are also aware of that. And that what they behaved in the state of California on this recall issue showed they did not really want to become president, because they weren't willing to make sure they carried the state of California, which is decisive in determining marginally the next president of the United States. And they were going to turn it over to this carnival geek act show called Arnie Schwarzenegger, who's also involved with people who stole from California, who looted it. And you wait to see what Schwarzenegger does to the trade unions in California and to the Hispanic Americans in California. He's going to go after them first. This man has the qualifications of an Adolf Hitler. He's a beast man. He is what you saw in Terminator. That's the man. You vote for it, that's what you get. So now we're in a situation where it's clear that while some people in the Senate, as typified by Senators Byrd and Kennedy, have broken free of the control of the gag rules of the Democratic National Committee to speak out plainly on issues which needed speaking. And some other people in the Senate have had things to say, Joe Biden and others, which are quite relevant. The House of Representatives is a slave of this Tom DeLay tyranny. They're almost afraid to breathe up down there. But the Senate has shown that the temperament of the Democratic Party, and also some Republicans, is to bring this nonsense to an end, to bring the Cheney nonsense to an end and what that represents, to get rid of the neocons and so forth. So it's not hopeless. But we're now at a point where you've got really three candidates left. Me, Kerry, and Dean. But Dean's not worth it. I wouldn't recommend anybody vote for him. Jimmy Dean would be better. But Kerry has to be treated seriously because of his backing in position, even though I think he's wimped out a few times where he shouldn't have done that. I don't think he's qualified to be president, but he's qualified to be a candidate. And therefore, it's good to have him in there. It's all right to have Gephardt in there, too. I don't think he's going to go anyplace. But the three of us are there. The rest of them are also Rands. We're down to three candidates. And we're down to the point that the Democratic National Committee has to undergo a reform, a serious reform. It's 1 year and a little over 3 months to the next inauguration. Yeah? We're a little more than a year from the next election, presidential election. The foolishness has to stop now. And therefore, I speak as I do, and I say without fear of exaggeration that given the present world situation and our national situation, and notably given my special accomplishments as an economist, I'm probably the only person qualified to become president of the United States at this time. And California has helped to make that clear. We have entered the acute phase of a general breakdown crisis of the world's present monetary financial system. I've seen this coming for a long time. I've warned about it. I've never been wrong in any forecasts I've made in this respect. It's here. If I tell you it's here, it's here. If you look at yesterday's figures, or the day before's figures, on the state of the U.S. economy, if you look at the current account deficit, if you look at our total foreign national debt, foreign debt, if you look at our trade situation, if you look at our internal indebtedness, particularly in the area of credit card debt, the housing bubble about to break, in which suddenly we turn so-called nominal homeowners into squatters because the banks don't want them to leave, even though they've lost the house. because they'd rather have the squatters that lived there already than have new ones come in. They were at that kind of situation. Employment is being cut. We're a bankrupt nation. Europe is in a similar condition. The situation in Mexico, Central America, South America is beyond belief. Japan is about to blow. Japan is bankrupt. Its financial system is bankrupt. And it went bankrupt trying to print dollars to pump up the Wall Street market, financial market. Japan began printing money at night, loaned it as yen. The yen are converted to dollars. The dollars are dumped as dollars into the U.S. market. In the U.S. market, do they go into the economy? No, they go into Wall Street, where they pump up the values of stock prices and similar things. And nothing trickles down to the economy. Let's get that first, the series of triple curves on at this point. And this is what I developed in. This is the first of three curves I'll show you right now. This I developed in 1995. I was at a Vatican conference on health care. And in the process, I submitted this as a pedagogical, because you don't expect nuns and priests necessarily to be the best economists in the world. So to try to make it clear to them what I was talking about. What we have is this. Now, if we measure what we produce and consume in terms of what are called market baskets, we have the following picture. By market baskets, I mean the market basket of household consumption, direct consumption by household, chiefly physical things, necessary medical services, which is a physical thing, education, which is a physical thing. You get it at a school, you get it through a teacher or something. Huh? Also infrastructure. Not only capital goods, maintaining machinery, but also maintaining the national railway system, maintaining the highway system, maintaining municipal functions, maintaining the production and distribution of power, maintaining water and sanitation, water supplies and sanitation, and so forth and so on. That in physical terms, the per capita output of the United States has been declining since approximately 1966-67. Now, this is a simplified picture of it. I'll get to something more actual statistics in just a moment. But in this period, we have been skyrocketing in terms of the amount of financial assets. In other words, the financial assets, the so-called financial values of the United States have been zooming, and prices have been zooming, while the physical content of the dollar has been collapsing, what you can buy. And this has been catastrophic in the past 2 years, as many of you know from personal experience. Huh? This process has been pumped up by issuing monetary aggregate, money, printing press money, and more recently, electronic printing press money, by electronic emission of monetary aggregate, credit. So, take the next one. This is what it looks like in terms of actual data from 1966 on. These are the trends. Next. Okay. Now, the change occurred on Clinton's watch. Remember that 1966 was a disastrous year where we had to make a turn, and we had an election coming up, and Bill Clinton was supporting Al Gore. And we got Gore. Right? Clinton was re-elected, but things were bad as a result of a failure to make certain changes in policy. That is the capitulation to Newt Gingrich that year, remember? Failure to make certain changes in policy. We were headed toward a series of financial crises, global financial crises. The first one occurred, it was called the Japan crisis. It was caused in part by George Soros, called the Asia crisis. which affected the countries of South and East Asia. China managed to duck that one by refusing to let its yuan be meddled with at that time. Then we had, the following year, 1998, we had the Russian bond crisis. Now, the Russian bond crisis was largely a gift indirectly of Al Gore. Al Gore, as vice president, had been meddling with Russian politics, and particularly with the re-election of Yeltsin. And he became involved with a very dirty drug-running operation called Golden Ada, based in California. And this process led the financing of Yeltsin's good appearance, shall we say, coming out of that re-election campaign, for his re-election campaign, resulted in the 1998 GKO Russian bond crisis, which caused a collapse of a major financial operation on Wall Street. In August, it almost brought the system down, August of 1998. Well, Clinton threatens in September to do something about monetary reform. He threatened in a speech that he gave in New York, and then he backed down, which was the worst thing you can do. Don't go to threaten the bankers and then back down. They'll come to kill you. And they did. You remember the case of Monica Lewinsky. That was a booby trap stuck in the basement, which they set off to try to get him impeached, because he had threatened to tamper with their interests, their financier interests. Now, we moved some of us to fight, and he didn't get impeached. He was charged, but he was not impeached. But nonetheless, in October of 1998, what happened was that at a Washington Monetary Conference, a decision was made to duck the issue. And they resorted to something which George Soros was involved in, a wall of money, to try to forestall what was an imminent Brazil crisis of February 1999. Now, let's go back to that last curve, the third of it. All right, here's what happened. In order to try, what George had suggested, George Soros, he's associated with drug legalization, as they call it. Huh? All right, what they'd done is this so-called wall of money policy. That is to throw so much monetary aggregate at a collapsing financial system that you would resuscitate the system by artificial respiration. As a result of that, by the spring of 1999, the rate of monetary emission was accelerating beyond the rate of financial assets, value assets, which is what the crossover indicates. And there was a catastrophic increase in the rate of collapse of physical economy. By the spring of 2000, it was obvious that this trend of an acceleration of monetary aggregates in an attempt to maintain the financial system was putting us into something like a Weimar 1923 style hyperinflation. But nonetheless, it's continued. And the system is on the verge of blowing out. Now, because of free will, you can never predict the exact time that something will occur. Once in a while, you can, as I did in 1987, when in June and July I said it's likely we're going to have an October blowout of the financial system like we haven't seen, on Wall Street, that we haven't seen before. And it happened in October as I forecast, exactly. Sometimes you can call the shot that closely based on the factors involved. But in this case, most cases, you cannot predict exactly when a crisis will occur because there is free will involved. Now, free will won't prevent the crisis condition from going away. It may, by use some factor, delay the crisis or to accelerate it to make it come on earlier. A mistake may make it come earlier, or some clever move may make it come later. But if you use trickery to postpone a crisis, you make the crisis worse. You're trying to do a backfire, you're actually spreading the forest fire. So that's what happened. So as of now, since that period, since the developments of 2000, as I forecast in the beginning of 2001, I said, since the President of the United States is a dummy, with certain known policies, the crisis which is now going on is going to become worse. And what I'm afraid of, I said, is that under these conditions, which are like Weimar or Germany 1923 or later, some damn fool is going to try to create a Reichstagsfire event to distract attention from the financial crisis and to get some kind of operation in place. And that happened September 11th, 2001. But the financial crisis has been going on, and now we've come to the point that it's in a terminal phase. Those in Europe are warning about it. More and more voices are warning about it. They all acknowledge. One points out this fact, another points out another fact. All the facts are true. The system is finished. And what the present administration is proposing, and what the present 10 rivals, or I guess one dropped out recently, ran, are failing to mention, what the Democratic National Committee refuses to face, is the fact we have that kind of crisis. And that the George Bush policies now will sink the nation. Some of those fools are going to say, well, let us sink the nation. We'll get elected. That's not a good way to get elected. But that's where we are. Therefore, the issue now is what? The issue comes down to this. It comes down to the same thing that brought Hitler and other fascist regimes to power in Europe from 1922 with Mussolini on, and got us into what became known as World War II. Whenever you have a major financial crisis, there's always a danger of a new type of general warfare. This has been the case in European history since the 1780s, since the financial crisis of France of the 1780s. At that point, a banking interest centered in Lord Shelburne's British East India Company orchestrated, beginning July 14th, 1789, orchestrated a wave of terror which later brought Napoleon Bonaparte to power. This terror, the Jacobin terror followed by the Napoleonic dictatorship, was the model for modern fascism, or what we call fascism today. The force that did this then were called Martinists. They were run largely from London, but it was a French language speaking group that ran it. This is the force which actually, in a sense, brought Napoleon III to power in France. This is the European interest, which is heavily involved in creating the Civil War in the United States. This is the interest which essentially was behind much of the orchestration of World War I. This is what brought Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, de Waal, Pétain, and so forth to power in Europe. And remember that in 1940, in June 1940, when the British Expeditionary Force with some French and Belgians was sitting on the beach at Dunkirk, waiting for the German armored divisions to come clean them out, those armored divisions halted under Hitler's orders. Why? Why didn't Hitler wipe out the British Expeditionary Force when he could have? Because he had people like Lord Halifax in London and others who were Hitler lovers. And they had a scheme. And that scheme was to bring France and Britain into a confederation with Mussolini, Franco, and so forth, and Japan, and to immediately attack the Soviet Union, which they thought would be a quick victory with such united forces. And then, once the Soviet Union was crushed, to take the combined naval forces of Germany, France, the British Empire, Italy, and Japan for an attack on the United States. Now that attack, the Japan part of the attack, was what occurred on December 7th, 1941. This was World War II. And the issue was what? The issue was this. Whenever you have a financial system in crisis, governments are faced with the following problem. If society has accumulated financial debts beyond the ability of society to pay those debts, then the question is, who is going to give? Is the government going to intervene to say that the lives and welfare of its people are its primary responsibility? Or is government going to intervene and say, we don't care if we have to kill people to do so, we're going to pay the debts? And it's that kind of issue which has hit the world repeatedly since the 1780s and the bankruptcy of France, which is facing us again today. Are we going now to say the debts will be paid at any cost? Take the case of Argentina, Brazil, and so forth. Are we going to continue that IMF policy in other cases, and even against the people of the United States? Are we going to kill our own people by economic means in order to try to roll over the debt which the Bush administration and previous administrations have been piling up against us? Or are we going to say that we go by the preamble of our Constitution in these matters? The Constitution, a preamble in particular, which expresses natural law as it developed in Europe, especially after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. That our responsibility as government, under our preamble, is to defend the sovereignty of our nation, number one. Number two, to protect the general welfare and promote the general welfare of all of our people. And third, to assure these benefits to posterity. Under those conditions, when you had a crisis like this, government must put the system through bankruptcy reorganization. That does not mean shut down the banks. What it means is the following. It means that the government must take the central banking systems into receivership, including the bankrupt, in fact, Federal Reserve System. Our banking system is bankrupt. That's a fact. It's only being propped up politically by the political impression that we don't dare do anything about it. It's bankrupt. Therefore, the government must put the bankrupt system into receivership for bankruptcy reorganization. Now, you're not going to close down things. You're going to take action to make sure not only that the firm continues to operate, but that the employment and production increases. That is essentially the approach that Franklin Roosevelt took in 1933. You must defend the people first. You're not going to smash things. You're not going to close banks down. You're going to reorganize them. You're going to keep them in business. You're going to keep the flow of payment of pensions going. You're going to keep the essential institutions functioning. You're going to keep essential businesses operating. And you're going to make the economy grow so that you can build your way out of the crisis. That's the issue before us now. And that's what takes the nerve out of many people who otherwise might be competent candidates for president under other circumstances. It takes the juices out of them. That frightens them. They're afraid of banking. That was the case then, in July 14th, 1789. Two stooges for the British head of the British political system, Lord Shelburne, the Philippe Égalité, a cousin and pretender to the French throne, and Jacques Necker, a banker from Lausanne, Switzerland, conspired to organize the siege of the Bastille, to induce the guards to shoot, and to get the mob to lynch the guards. And that was the beginning of a process using British agents, Danton, British agent Marat, and others under British direction to conduct what became known as the Jacobin Terror, to destroy Britain's great rival, France, which had been our friend. And that has been the pattern since that time. It's now called the Seneca's pattern, which was called during the World War II period, and which is called today. The problem is that what Dick Cheney represents, I think he's an idiot. I tell you why I think he's an idiot. He's a bully. He's a playground bully, not a thinker. What he did was, back last 2002, in August, September, I publicly denounced him for fraud in the case of getting us into a war in Iraq. I said he was a liar, impeachable, or should resign. Now, I've been saying that, as some of you may have observed, with a certain degree of persistence over the intervening months. And it's my information of several past weeks that Dick Cheney suddenly discovered that I am his oppressor. An indication of that irony appeared on the federal page of the Washington Post this morning. So Dick Cheney is shaken a bit. And it's time to say bye-bye, boy, again. Now, Dick Cheney is not simply a bum, though he fully qualified for that status. Much better than vice president. President of vice is not a good qualification. But we have another policy, another problem. We have a military and related policy. Going back to World War II, going back to those 2 unnecessary nuclear missiles dropped on the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which did not do one thing to end the war. Anyone who says 1 million lives, American lives, were saved by those bombs is a liar or an absolute fool, babbling fool. It had nothing to do with anything. The war was already won. It was done for a different purpose, and it was made clear by the author of the nuclear policy, Bertrand Russell, who's known as a pacifist. Kill everybody and call it peace. Bertrand Russell had a policy of preventive nuclear war. This policy was supported by various people inside the United States government as well, the right wing, including Democratic Party right wing, like Truman. The policy was that we are going to dominate the world at the end of this war. What we want to establish with our British partner, we are going to become a part of a British Commonwealth. The United States is going to fuse with Great Britain and Australia and so forth, become part of a British Commonwealth. The English-speaking peoples. Make English a bad word. Anyway, but the point was, that, as Russell said explicitly, and he said it publicly, published it in September of 1946, the purpose of his nuclear policy, which was the purpose of dropping those 2 bombs on Japan, was to use nuclear weapons as a threat so terrible the nations would surrender their sovereignty to world government in order to avoid warfare. That was the policy. That policy continued to be the policy under Truman. And fool Truman got us into a Korean War by his foolishness. And what we did in this country, we dumped Truman and told him to get. Go back to haberdashery. We don't need you. We brought Eisenhower in to get us out of not only that nuclear war, or that Korean War, but also a nuclear warfare danger. What had happened during this period is that the crazy policies of Truman, contrary to Roosevelt's policies, had gotten us into what was actually an inevitable war in Korea by pushing on the Chinese and Soviets at the same time. And it was inevitable there was going to be a reaction. And the reaction came from both the Soviet and Chinese government in the form of the Korean operation from North Korea into South Korea. And this was telegraphed, and this was forced into being as a reaction by Truman. Because they assumed that by using terror of that sort against the Soviet Union, which they thought did not yet have a nuclear weapon, that they could bully the world into submitting to an Anglo-American world government. And Truman had believed that. And they took the risk. But then, in the meantime, the Soviet system developed a thermonuclear weapon before the United States. At that point, the Bertrand-Russell policy of preventive war had to be called off. Truman was dumped, retired, and Eisenhower, who is a traditionalist, not of this funny type, gave us, with all his imperfections, two terms of peace. And on the way out, in a speech, he warned against the military-industrial complex. Now, that was a funny name for it. It was accurate in description. But he said that's the threat to this nation. It's the same threat that gave us Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and so forth back in the between 1920s and 1930s. It's that philosophy. That philosophy today is represented by Dick Cheney and the neoconservatives, by that right wing, which talks about preventive nuclear war, talks about using mini-nukes, are trying to get a fuss going in Korea, under which Korea threatens to use its nuclear weapons in defense, and then overnight Japan and South Korea develop their nuclear weapons, and you've got a nuclear warfare in the Korean Peninsula and Japan. And some idiots don't want peace. This is Cheney. This is Cheney's policy. This is the policy of the neoconservatives. This is the bunch of fools who are controlling the Bush administration today. That's what our problem is. So if you want to get through to next year, to the next election, get rid of Cheney now. Tell that man to go. Go with God, but go. The way this policy was shaped, or misshaped under Cheney and company, and the neocons, was that when the Soviet system collapsed in 1989, 90, 92, Cheney was among the idiots who tried unsuccessfully to persuade the president at that time, President George H.W. Bush, to go for world empire, to thrust immediately for an occupation of Iraq, and to take on the Soviet Union and establish an Anglo-American world empire immediately, but by an immediate process. The Bush administration at that time said no. Cheney stuck to it. Cheney has continued that policy until, in various ups and downs, until September 11th, 2001. And the first thing he did in 2001 is bring that policy of his, that preventive nuclear war policy, for world government, for world empire, to the fore again. And that's why we went into Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan not because of terrorism. We went into Afghanistan because we needed to tell the Europeans to give us bases, their support for bases in Afghanistan. We used the fact that the Europeans gave us that degree of support to set up the basing for a war on Iraq. The war on Iraq was ready to go in 2002. Some of us jammed it up. They postponed it. We got it into the United Nations. We postponed it. Then they were about to lose the shot. The United Nations Security Council was about to vote on Iraq on the following Monday or Tuesday. So on the weekend, Bush was pushed into opening the war. A totally unnecessary war. But a war which was launched for one purpose: to take the United States down the road toward war. Getting Sharon, the stooge of these neocons, to attack Syria, to attack Iran, to escalate the fight around North Korea. These are ongoing things now. What is happening in the Gaza Strip, in the Middle East, is part of the same thing. The contention around Sudan is the same thing. The negotiation around Sudan and Garang is aimed to bring down Sudan. If you bring down Sudan, you bring down Egypt. That's what these fools are up to. The world is prepared to respond to this. And just as fool Truman and his administration got us into a Korean War on the assumption that China and the Soviet Union would not resist, because of the superiority of our nuclear weapons. The same mistake is being made now by the neocons and the fools who believe them. If we continue to push in this direction, if we let Syria be attacked, if we let Iran be attacked, if we let the North Korean crisis run out of control, we are going to be in an irreversible process leading toward a general war, which will be not the war we choose to fight, but the war we impose upon ourselves, as in Iraq. This war will be what's called asymmetric warfare. It will include mini-subs, hard to find. It will include weapons stuck in the mud on coasts. It will mean all kinds of things that are done in the name of irregular warfare. It will be a general war like the world has never known before. A war of an asymmetric reaction to the potentiality of a global thermonuclear holocaust. Now, you're trapped between the level which if you want to fight war, you're going to get all the way thermonuclear holocaust. If you're not willing to go to a thermonuclear holocaust that destroys the planet, where are you going to go? You're going to try to find a middle ground, which is the mini nukes typifies. You're going to try to find a way of fighting war, even nuclear war, below the threshold of thermonuclear war. Under those conditions, the United States and civilization would be finished. We've got to stop what Cheney represents now. It's an easy thing to do. Just get him to resign. Thank you.